Interesting in this first paragraph, first sentence here, that it's actually a summary of what they've said before. So they kind of walking the walk and talking the talk. So if it's true that to argue persuasively you need to be in dialogue with others, in other words, conversation, then the ability to summarize what they say is critical. And if what other people say, what they say, is important, then you have to know how to summarize effectively what they say. Also note the definition here, right? They define. What are they defining? Summary. What a summary is. Some writers are guilty of summarizing too much. Some writers are guilty of summarizing too little. So, the general rule is good summaries require a balance. And you can probably guess what this balance is. They say, and what you say, towards the subjective and the objective. But don't forget, it all has to do with what your purpose is for your audience. So, how do we write a good summary? By suspending your own beliefs. Peter Elbow, famous writer and teacher of writers, says you have to play the believing game. And you have to play the game so well that as a writer, you shouldn't be able to tell whether you are for or against. If you can't suspend your belief when you're summarizing, you will come across as someone who is obviously biased, and that undermines your credibility. Check the bias out in this summary. We're looking for bias. Angry rant, that's an opinion. Accuses fast food companies. Evil conspiracy. Finally, he gets to saying he disagrees. We already know he disagrees from what he said before. This makes for a very incredible summary. Our authors also are careful to note that the author of this summary has given up on what Zinchenko says after only one sentence. I mean, how fair is that? He has one sentence and then he does his own thing. Now, there is a place for short one-sentence or two-sentence summaries, but this is not one of them. Sometimes in the social sciences, they note here, you want to summarize quickly, like in a review of the literature. But if I have asked you, your assignment has been to summarize an article, then I certainly want more than a paragraph. I know the rule of thumb is 20%, but your summaries that you're doing right now are going to be anywhere from 30 to 50%. A little bit longer than what is considered. And if you do this, what you end up with is, I think it's a brilliant analysis here. is that if you don't do this, then you will fail to have a conversation. In fact, you'll be having a conversation with someone who doesn't exist. And really, you'll be having a conversation with a product of your own biases and preconceptions. It's hard to do this. We don't think it is, but there are biases built into our brains that make this not an easy task. Of course, you can't forget that you're not just summing up somebody else's words for the sake of summarizing. What they say here is that paradoxically, it requires you, while we want you to be fair, it also means that your bias has to have some influence. And this is a great example here, and this is pretty sophisticated text here. It's arguing that, okay, how do you do that? How do you look backwards to what others have written and forwards to what you want to prove? This is where you stand. How do you do both of these at the same time? For example, if you want to argue that the parents and not the fast food companies are to blame for the children's obesity, you have to set up the argument in a different way. And this is how this author would do that, looking backwards and looking forwards. First, he talks about how in his article, Don't Blame the Eater, that Zinchenko blames the fast food industry. Okay? So how does he do that? Inadequate labels, nutritionally void food, overtaxed working parents, long working hours, unable to supervise, easily victimized by low-cost calorie-laden foods. In other words, it's, some people might blame the fast food industry. And then, of course, he relates the story that Zinchenko provides. But what this author does instead is to disagree. It says, Zinchenko, Z says this, X, I say Y. And the Y here is, in my view, however, it is parents and not the food chains who are responsible for their children's obesity. Looking back to what Zinchenko said, looking forward to what the author says. So, looking back to what they say, looking forward to what I say. So, as they point out here, this is fair. If you're not fair, your reader will know it. Your reader will suspect it, and then they won't trust you. And then you've lost them. You've lost your audience. So what does this mean? Well, it seems obvious that you wouldn't summarize something that you wouldn't use in your own paper. But sometimes people do that. So what they suggest is that you align what they say with what you say. It is a good thing, yes. When you're revising, you want to make sure that those are aligned together. And if you don't, you'll probably end up with something they call a list summary, which is just an inventory of what's been included. Even with your iSearch, all of your research should be summarized to point towards what? Answering the question. If it doesn't, it's not necessary and shouldn't be in there. What they say should match up with what is important for the iSearch. And just as this, in the same way, if you're writing a persuasive paper, it should line up with what you're trying to argue. This illustration points to a typical list summary. And notice the audience down here. They're falling asleep. And then, and then, and then, and then. Boring. Please note how our authors follow their own rules here. It's a nice transition sentence for your audience. It's the conclusion. You want to be fair, represent an author's view accurately, but you want to do it in a way that fits your own composition's larger agenda, what its purpose is. On the one hand, sound familiar? You want to play the believing game and do justice to the person you're summarizing. But on the other hand, a summary's got to have some sort of purpose, or what they call a slant or a spin, that prepares the way for your own claims. Sure, you want to summarize what they say, but it's for the purpose is ultimately about what you say. Else, why bother?